Hello and welcome to CoronaNomics, brought to you by Econ Films. This week, radical uncertainty. The COVID crisis has plunged us into a world of quite extraordinary economic confusion. Could there be another spike of infections? How will consumers behave in a post-COVID world? It's no exaggeration to say the fate of the global economy hinges on those questions to which we simply cannot know the answers. What are the implications of this radical uncertainty? Should it change the way policymakers think? Should it prompt reform of the discipline of economics itself? I'm Ben Chu, economics editor of The Independent.
And I'm Lizzy economics reporter at The Telegraph. We'll be your guides, and if you like what we're doing, please subscribe as it helps people to find us.
Joining us this week is Professor the Lord Mervyn King, the Governor of the Bank of England from 2003 to 2013, where he took a leading role in steering the UK through the financial crisis. He recently published Radical Uncertainty, Decision-Making Beyond the Numbers with John Kay, which explores how humans crave certainty where none exists, and how to make decisions where the future is unknowable.
Lord King, welcome to CoronaNomics.
Lizzy, hello, and Ben too.
The Great Depression led to Keynesianism, but out of the financial crisis, we had greater integration of financial markets into economic modelling. Given how much the last 6 months have exposed how hard it is to predict the future, should a focus on decision-making in uncertainty, which is immeasurable by definition, rather than risk, which we can measure, be the biggest change to come out of macroeconomic thinking in the COVID crisis?
Well, I hope so, because I think the attempt to pretend that risk and uncertainty meant the same thing, which has been very much the central tenet of economics for half a century or more, is mistaken. Risk is different from uncertainty, and it's important to understand why. Models can be very helpful, but they provide insights. What they're not good at doing is making quantitative predictions about the future. And we've seen that over many years in respect of economic models, and we're seeing it this year in respect of epidemiological models.
Well, on the subject of what people expect economists to do, we've got a poll here by the Economics Network and which shows the public think the top job of economists is to forecast economic conditions. We know not all economists do is forecasting, but it's clearly something that's associated with the profession, at least in the public's mind. I wonder, is there a problem with the way economists present their ability to forecast?
Well, having discussed this with many economists, they seem to feel under enormous pressure to respond to this demand for forecasts and for a sort of bogus certainty. And I think this has been a terrible mistake. Economics provides incredibly important insights. It helps you to think about how the world works. But instead of pretending to respond to this demand for precise quantitative forecasts, economists would do much better to lay out the issues, explain that these are the qualitative judgments that have to be made, and to point to the use of models in guiding us to say, well, these are the 3 or 4 really crucial numbers that we need to know more about. Let's do some research into what these numbers are. Focus more on orders of magnitude than on this absurd precision which we get both in economic forecasts, but also today in epidemiological forecasts. These are a detraction, I think, from the ability of modelers to help us understand what's going on.
If Michael Gove's take is anything to go by, then it seems people have had enough of experts. I wonder if you think that being more explicit about this difference that you raised between uncertainty and risk would give economists more credibility in the public's mind.
When you take an aeroplane flight, you don't want people drawn from the passengers to fly the plane. You want a qualified pilot. But what you don't want is for the pilot to be able to claim that he knows more than he does. So a good pilot says, well, we think the conditions will be fine flying en route. There may be some clouds. If we find them, we'll try and go around them. And that, I think, is what people expect, which is not that individuals charged because of their expertise to make decisions pretend to know everything about the future, but that they will respond to what we learn as we go along this journey. And the same really should be true both of central banks, economists, and medical experts pretending to know precisely how the epidemic will evolve. What we need to be able to do is to respond to what we're learning as we go along.
Well, on the subject of how much it's possible to forecast, there seems to be an obsession with the alphabet soup of what shape the recovery will take, whether it's a V or a U or a W or a sideways J or an L. But is even putting a letter instead of a number on the recovery overstating the remit of economists?
Yes, and I think it's a mistake to use the same words that we use for a business cycle downturn. This is not a recession in the normal sense. What we're experiencing is a government mandated shutdown of the economy, followed by the government's attempt to encourage people to go back to work and to go to shops and spend again, but still combined with quite a high degree of social restrictions, both distancing and the fact that cinemas, theatres, concert halls are still closed. Now, what we need to do is to ask the question, what's going on here? And the answer is that people are now very nervous and worried about resuming their previous pattern of life and work, and in particular using public transport. So focusing on that would be much more helpful. And in that context, it does seem a bit odd for people to talk about conventional monetary and fiscal stimulus as a response both to a government mandated shutdown on the one hand, where the government doesn't want to encourage the economy to expand while it's shutting it down. But then also when you're confronted with a situation in which the restrictions are relaxed and people have to make judgments, is it safe for me to go back and go to the same restaurants I went to before? The idea that a small change in interest rates or printing more money is going to have a significant impact on that decision does seem to me rather naive. I wouldn't want to predict what would happen because I do not know how quickly people's confidence will be restored. I think what you can know are the following things. First of all, we learnt the importance of resilience. It was something which we did not take seriously enough for the banking system before the financial crisis more than a decade ago. And we learnt to our cost that we needed to improve the resilience of the banking system. And we did that. But now what we're realizing is we needed to do more to make the health system more resilient and to be able to make sure that we have the capability of doing what are theoretically rather straightforward things, but logistically prove very difficult. That is, getting enough protective equipment to healthcare workers, moving them from A to B, ensuring that we could get loans out to small businesses and self-employed people, ensuring that we could improve our testing capacity, improving our resilience in these dimensions is very important. And then looking ahead, it would seem a pretty obvious conclusion that the way to restore confidence is to get a vaccine. Now, we can't be certain that there will be one, but certainly it would make sense to devote significant resources to promoting and developing a vaccine. I think governments are doing that now, but that does seem to me the point at which it would then be possible to argue that we can start to think of the lack of spending or production in more conventional terms. The government has the unenviable task of trying to navigate a path between two very difficult sets of rocks on which we could founder. One set of rocks is rising infections and higher deaths from COVID-19. And the further away we steer from that by looking down the economy, the closer we get to the other set of rocks, which is a substantial fall in incomes and output, jobs and GDP. We don't know enough at this stage to calculate anything that could be called an optimal path between those two sets of rocks. It's bound to be trial and error. And I think a narrative by government which sets out that very clearly and says there are trade-offs involved. We can't be certain what those trade-offs are at present. This is what it will depend on. People gain confidence not from a misplaced sense of overconfidence by governments and authorities, but by a sense of honesty in which they can see that people are struggling with a problem. They don't have the perfect answer to it, but they are genuine and they're being open and transparent. And that's the way you build up credibility. And I think that governments have been tempted to be too confident about the right thing to do. And then because they've had to change their mind as time went on, understandably, as we learnt more about the virus, then they've had to be equally confident about some different course of action. And it hasn't led to a consistent or compelling narrative.
Yeah. Just to be clear, Lord King, talking about the macroeconomic response, are you suggesting it might be premature to be encouraging people to go out and eat at restaurants or encouraging people to spend, given the uncertainty about the remission of the virus?
No, if governments feel that it's safe to do so under the conditions they lay down, then it's reasonable to encourage people to go out. What is not reasonable is to think that just printing more money or cutting interest rates will achieve that objective. I don't think people are going to say, I'm still worried about them going to the restaurant, but because the interest rate is now minus 1% rather than 0, I'm prepared to save less and go out to the restaurant. I just don't think that's a sensible way to think about it.
Investors in governments face uncertainty just as investors in businesses do. And the bank's current governor, Andrew Bailey, said something quite startling on the 22nd of June, referring to alarming falls in the traded value of UK sovereign debt back in March, before the bank pushed the button on another £200 billion of asset purchases. He said the government would have struggled to fund itself in the short run.
We basically had a pretty near meltdown of some of the core financial markets. I got to Wednesday afternoon and the markets team came down here and in the afternoon, and it's not good when they turn up en masse, and it's not good when they say we've got to talk, and it wasn't good, and we were in a state of I've said borderline disorderly. I mean, it was disorderly in the sense that when you looked at volatility in what was core markets, so this is core exchange rates, core government bond markets, we were seeing things that were pretty unprecedented, certainly in recent times. And we were facing serious disorder.
So let's drill down a little bit into that meltdown, as Andrew Bailey put it, in core markets. We're going to see a chart now showing that March spike in gilt yields, which is, of course, the UK government's effective interest rate. So we've got the three maturities, 5-year, 10-year and 30-year there. And you can see a very sharp spike in late March, which subsided after the Bank of England cut interest rates and increased quantitative easing. So, Lord King, the question that some are asking now is whether gilts can still be regarded as that they are going to be paid back no matter what, in all circumstances by the UK government, or is radical uncertainty part of this market too now?
I think you can be fairly confident that the UK government will pay back its debts, and I have no concerns on that front at all. I think what happened in mid-March was a very short-term phenomenon. It wasn't restricted to the United Kingdom. Central banks took the action that was needed in order to deal with short-term market turbulence. And we've seen that before in other markets, the flash crash. We've seen various episodes in which some core markets appeared to have been behaving oddly for short periods. But I think what is very striking about what's happened in the last few months, and this is in real contrast to the financial crisis, is that financial markets have behaved extremely well, and they have carried on functioning, even though no one has been able to go into the buildings in which they normally operate. This has been a crisis which started out in the wider economy, initially in China, spread around the world, and has impacted financial markets. Whereas in 2008, what we saw was a crisis that began in financial markets and spread out to the wider economy. So it's the reverse this time. I would have no concerns about what is happening in government and bond markets. And I don't think the big issue facing us today is the behavior of financial markets. It's a health crisis.
You mentioned earlier the sort of reforms in banking after the 2008 financial crisis. And of course, you pushed very hard and successfully for banks to fund themselves with far less debt than they had been previously, as a way of making the overall financial market system more resilient to what an unknowable future might bring. But the Bank of England's executive director, Andrew Houser, said recently that bond market turbulence, which of course, as you say, happened not just in the gilt market, but in US Treasuries too, could be related to leveraged hedge funds unloading their positions to meet urgent cash demands. These funds are potentially destabilizing the entire system. Is that something that you wouldn't agree with? Do you not see that? Or could there actually be a new sort of too big to fail problem here?
Well, I think there is an issue which the Bank of England over the last 10 years has focused on quite a lot, which is that outside the banking system, there are funds, asset managers, which are investing in investments which may be perfectly good investments, but they're not ones that can be turned into ready cash on the same day. And yet they are saying to their investors, if you need cash on the same day, you can sell your shares in the fund and we'll give you cash. These two things are incompatible. It's almost the maturity transformation problem that takes place now outside the banking system.
I mean, so hedge funds, you think it's appropriate that the bank is looking at perhaps putting more regulation on that particular sector?
Well, I think it's a question of maturity mismatch, and not all hedge funds are engaged in that. Many of them certainly invest in illiquid investments, but they don't promise liquid returns to their investors. So I think it is quite important to distinguish between exactly what is being promised the ultimate investors from the ability of the intermediary, the hedge fund, asset manager, whatever, to turn their own investments into cash. It's that mismatch that is the worrying part of it.
I want to ask you about a recent non-probabilistic prediction of yours. Speaking to Jagjit Chadha on the Economics Observatory website, you said that there is a chance governments may want to take away some of the power of central banks. I wonder what leads you to that conclusion. Presumably you wouldn't go as far as your former deputy at the Bank of England, Paul Tucker, who said last month whether the Bank of England still exists or whether it's now reverted to being the operational arm of the Treasury.
Some central banks, in particular the Federal Reserve and the European Central Bank, have engaged in what one can only describe as quasi-fiscal action. That is, they have done things that one would normally regard as the purview of governments and parliaments, and have been buying private sector assets, engaging in risky investments on behalf of taxpayers. That's not something which central banks have the mandate to do. And even if the actions were the right actions, the question that will be raised afterwards is, well, should central banks be the people who make that decision? Should it not be governments or parliaments that decide on the scale of these actions? That, after all, was exactly what happened in the United States when Congress criticized the Federal Reserve for going beyond its mandate in bailing out the banking system in New York. And as a result, the legislation that was subsequently passed, the Dodd-Frank Act, removed some of the powers of the Federal Reserve to deal with banking crises in the future. That is a dangerous thing to do. But the point was that there needs to be a very clear division of responsibility between governments and parliaments on the one hand and independent central banks on the other to decide what central banks have the ability to do for themselves. And I don't think engaging in fiscal action is an appropriate thing for central banks to do. I don't think it's a central case, but I think it's a risk that politicians will say, well, central banks have become even more of the only game in town, and we don't think they should be making those decisions. We think we should, and therefore try to take some of the independence of central banks. If that were to happen, then I think it's very difficult for central banks to retain complete independence in respect of monetary policy, and then you may get the move to an era, whether it's governments deciding on how much quantitative easing, or governments getting central banks to commit to yield curve control, which is what the Federal Reserve implemented after the Second World War, until in 1951, the Federal Reserve and the US Treasury reached an accord which allowed the Fed to abandon yield curve control so that it could raise interest rates in order to control inflation. And I think, therefore, it is dangerous to commit to a path down which you may be preventing yourself from taking the policy responses that maybe, we don't know, but may be needed to control inflation. And I think the central banks that will survive best are those where there's a very clear demarcation between what the government does, what Parliament does, and what the central bank does. In that respect, I think the UK is in a stronger position than most central banks. It is Parliament that sets the inflation target. There was an occasion I remember when one cabinet minister wanted the bank to buy and give special support to the motor car industry. And I said, well, that may be the right thing to do for the United Kingdom, but it shouldn't be the Bank of England that makes that judgment. That should be a judgment made by your government. So please talk to the Chancellor. And if you decide you want to do that, we can set up a vehicle by which it could be done. You would take the decisions. We would act as your agent. You would take the risks. Actually, we heard nothing more after that. But it shows the point, which is that central banks, politicians love central banks to do things to get them off the hook. But then they want central banks to take responsibility for things which really ought to be the responsibility of the government.
Touched on negative interest rates before, and in your last book, The End of Alchemy, you argued that interest rates have been too low for too long. So what would be on your agenda if you were at the bank now?
Well, I mean, we have to get through this immediate crisis, and I suspect that government doesn't really have a lot of extra bandwidth to absorb, difficult long-term messages. But the solution here is for governments, both individually and collectively around the world, to chart a path out of the disequilibrium into which the world economy has fallen and got itself rather stuck. And that's going to mean, I think, a range of policies, none of which really are for central banks to implement. They will require, I think, changes in structures, spending of different governments, changes in exchange rates. Germany has a significantly undervalued real exchange rate. It's got now excess capacity in the export industry. It needs to shift resources into the production for domestic demand. These are very difficult things to achieve within a monetary union, but they'll need to find a way to do it. And countries like China are trying actually rather hard to shift away from relying on exports to rely more on domestic demand. I think we will need to see some greater cooperation between countries to achieve that. But we will need ourselves to shift resources in the UK away from the production of consumer goods to the production of exports, import substitutes, and investment. And that is something which central banks, through the use of monetary policy, can't easily achieve. I would like to see these changes in policies made around the world so that after a few years, central banks would then find it natural to raise interest rates to get back to more normal levels.
But you have said before that negative interest rates aren't a long-term solution. You said that in May, I think. Have you changed your mind as the crisis has panned out?
No, I don't even think they're a short-term solution, if I'm honest. I think the idea that we have spent 10 years or more encouraging people to borrow more, to spend more, sacrificing future consumption. After 10 years of that, there isn't a lot of future consumption left to sacrifice. And I think the effectiveness of very low interest rates has run its course. We need different policy instruments. You would think that someone looking at this from the outside would say, the last 10 years have been a period of unnaturally low growth. We came out of a recession really rather quickly, actually. But then we had stagnation for a decade, despite the biggest monetary stimulus the world has ever seen. A natural conclusion from that observation is that monetary stimulus isn't the answer to the stagnation that we've been experiencing. And I rather regret the fact that there seems to be, both within the economics profession and in many central banks, a belief that a simple model with only one commodity that gets produced in the economy means that just even lower interest rates is the answer. And I can't see any theoretical justification for that proposition.
And Lord King, would you add QE to that list of things which are not a good idea? More further QE at the moment would not be a good idea?
Well, there are two arguments for QE at present. The first one is the one that Andrew Bailey talked about in one of his other statements, which was the government is clearly going to be borrowing a very large amount of money over a short period for good reasons to try and get us through this crisis. It doesn't make sense to force the government to issue long-term debt in a great rush in a few weeks, so that the central bank can ease that problem by borrowing by buying government debt, and then gradually that could be released back onto the market to the private sector. So that the central bank has some role in the short run in smoothing the time path of government debt issuance. In the longer run, the argument for any quantitative easing is, do we need to expand the money supply in order to boost economic recovery? I don't think that's an issue that's been relevant for the last few months, because the government's been trying to shut down the economy. It doesn't want it to expand. Now we're beginning to recover. We're slowly moving into a period in which maybe the question of monetary and fiscal stimulus is relevant. But at this stage, I still think it's premature to argue that a big monetary stimulus is appropriate, because we still have significant aspects of a shutdown. Many sectors can't open at all. Doesn't look as if there'll be any live concerts, classical concerts in London until next spring. This is a long, long way off. You know, we've only been in this 4 months. And to see these parts of the economy shut down for another year possibly is still very significant. So I think we have to wait until we get to a point when it looks as if the economy has recovered to within a few percentage points of the level which it had reached at the very end of last year, before really feeling that we can end the temporary support schemes and think in terms of conventional monetary and fiscal stimulus. So I still think that is some way off. But the important thing is that decisions on QE are made by the Monetary Policy Committee, by the Bank of England, and they're made in the context of trying to meet their own remit.
Another source of uncertainty that businesses are already citing and is on the horizon as well is Brexit when it comes to their ability to plan. Yet Boris Johnson recently suggested that COVID-19 makes Brexit seem like a relatively small problem. Here's what he said.
One of the amazing things about the last few months, so about the whole COVID crisis, is I think it's put all those questions very much into perspective. And actually, I don't think that I've never have thought that the so-called Project Fear with Brexit would ever materialise in quite the way that some people did.
Do you agree with that view from the Prime Minister?
I do. I think that I never thought that Brexit was a major issue for the rest of Europe. Certainly wasn't for the rest of the world, despite the fact that some politicians wanted to jump in and claim otherwise. We'll come back to the UK in a minute, but COVID-19 is a global problem, and it's led to a global downturn. So I think we should be thinking of this as a much, much bigger thing than Brexit. Brexit will have some long-run impact on the pattern of trade. There'll be some trade creation, some trade diversion. I don't think that given the scale of restrictions or tariffs that are likely to be imposed, this is a major issue for the UK. And we can certainly cope with that without any difficulty. There'll be some short-term transitional issues if we don't get the planning for the new regime right. We don't yet know what that new regime will be. And it looks as if we're going to have a very short period for businesses to adjust either to whatever the free trade agreement turns out to be, or to trading under WTO rules if we don't get agreement on a long-term trade arrangement. But in either of those two cases, I don't see why the long-run impact is likely to be particularly significant. Whether COVID-19 turns out to be significant in the long run remains to be seen, but its impact on GDP this year and next year will certainly dominate anything which Brexit will involve.
On the short-term question, some people are talking about potential for a double-dip recession if we have a no-deal Brexit in January. Presumably, you don't think that's likely?
I don't know. It depends on what the transitional costs turn out to be and what the deal done is. I think that's impossible to say. But, use words like a double-dip recession. Let's suppose that output falls by 1 or 2% during that second dip of the double-dip recession. That's trivial in comparison with the fall in GDP that we've seen in the first half of this year. So COVID-19 has had a dramatic effect on the UK economy, as it has on the economies of most countries around the world, especially the industrialized world. And we don't yet know how quickly it would be possible to recover from that. Once we have a vaccine, one would expect quite a rapid bounce back, but to what level is unclear. And I think the pattern of spending and output may well be affected as people come to realize that resilience, not just of our health system, but of other parts of our society and economy, and resilience of individual businesses matter just as much as finding ways to get the cheapest source of supplies and inputs, so that the just-in-time supply chain will be complemented, I suspect, by the just-in-case supply chain, in which we have backup sources of supply, so that we don't see our businesses and our economy fail and disappear when we get one of these events occurring. After all, COVID-19 is a classic case of what John Kay and I call radical uncertainty, because we knew that pandemics could happen. In our book, we actually wrote that we should expect to be hit by an epidemic of an infectious disease caused by a virus that doesn't yet exist. But that didn't mean that we can make a quantitative prediction of the probability that a virus would come out of a particular place at a particular time of a particular year. We couldn't. But what you could do was to say, it is likely that at some point we will have a pandemic. We don't know when, we don't know where, we don't know what kind of pandemic it will be. But to improve the resilience and our ability to respond to that is of the utmost importance. And that's why getting away from bogus quantification to thinking about, what is really going on here, what are the important judgments that we have to make, is the essence of good decision making under uncertainty, not a failure to apply bogus scientific methods.
If COVID-19 does put Brexit into perspective, as you and the Prime Minister say, should the government actively pursue a no-deal Brexit then? That would keep lots of people happy who voted for it, surely.
Well, that's a different question altogether. And I think, I've always said about Brexit that reasonable people can differ on this, that there are arguments for staying in the EU and arguments for leaving. And once you've decided to leave, and we have now left, I'm sure there are arguments for a trade agreement, and there are also arguments for not signing up to something that would limit our ability to determine our own legal and regulatory arrangements. That does seem to be a red line. But these are things which are being actively discussed, and like all these negotiations, you never really know what the outcome will be and how close people are until the very last minute. There is always a wish, first of all, to avoid responsibility for a negotiation failing, which gives tremendous impetus to the desire to reach an agreement. But you also have no idea from the outside of how likely it is that people will compromise at the end. The European Union has a long history of discussions, agreements, disagreements, and in the end, at the very last minute, often beyond the time when the whistle should have been blown hours before, they finally reach some agreement. And we'll just have to see where we get to. I'm certainly not going to predict the outcome.
Well, thank you so much, Lord King. It's been a brilliantly stimulating conversation, ranging from Brexit to the COVID crisis to the nature of radical uncertainty and how decision makers should respond to that. So thank you so much, Lord King, for appearing on CoronaNomics.
We'll be talking to many more top thinkers in the weeks ahead to discuss how we can weather the economic storm of COVID-19. So please do stay tuned and subscribe to our YouTube channel.
And remember, if you like what we're doing, please hit like and share.
And if you'd like to talk to us, just leave us a comment below.
This has been CoronaNomics, brought to you by Econ Films.